We think of the broken heart as a metaphor, but it turns out it's actually a regular old hardcore black and white data point. And it's one of the oldest data points that has inspired me as a grief researcher, but actually has inspired a number of my colleagues quite independently. So it is the finding that people are more likely to experience illness and death after the death of a loved one. So literally the statistic is, for example, men whose wives have died in the first 3 months after that loss are almost twice as likely to die of a heart attack as another man who's very similar, whose wife does not die. And it's very high for women as well. It's slightly attenuated. But the point is,
hello, my grieving friends. It's your host, Lisa Keefauver here. Welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Now, just in case you're new to the show, this is a podcast all about grief. Over the past 6 seasons, we've explored the expansiveness and pervasiveness of grief in our lives. What I've learned over my 20 plus years now as a social worker and the more than a decade I've spent as a widow is that if we lean in, hold space, bear witness for one another in the most difficult seasons of our lives, that's where true healing and community building happens. And it isn't often that I invite guests back onto the show, but I'm thrilled to say that my friend Mary Frances O'Connor is back. If you don't know her, Mary Frances is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, also known as GLASS. That's where she investigates the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Last time she was here, if you remember that conversation, we explored her incredible first book, The Grieving Brain, which was, by the way, included on Oprah's list of best books to comfort a grieving friend. This time, she's here to discuss her latest book, The Grieving Body, How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing. I was actually lucky enough, I have to say, to read an advanced reader copy well ahead of publication and share my reflections on what readers can expect. And here's what I shared at the time. With A Grieving Body, O'Connor remarkably combines fascinating science, intimate storytelling, and her generous heart to help us better understand the very human experience of living while grieving and how to care for ourselves and our loved ones when grief inevitably arrives at our door. Now, that combination of researcher, storyteller, and vulnerable human is exactly what Mary Frances brings to our conversation in this episode. We explore the complexities of grief, emphasizing the importance of social connections, attachment, and the physiological impacts of loss. Now, the news that grief impacts our physical well-being is not meant to depress us or indicate that suffering is inevitable. As our subtitle suggests, it's simply an opportunity to learn how to tend to our grieving bodies. That's why we also discuss practical strategies for navigating grief, including the differentiation between energy and motivation in social interactions and the role of movement in healing. Well, friends, can you believe it? I'm so lucky to say for a second time on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Welcome to the show, Mary Frances O'Connor.
oh, it is so good to be here, Lisa. Thank you for having me.
I am so thrilled to be bringing your wisdom again to our listeners and to be having this deep dive conversation into your newest book, The Grieving Body. And for listeners watching on YouTube, or this is a clip, if you haven't read it, get it, but also start with her incredible book, The Grieving Brain, and also shout out to your illustrators for doing such a gorgeous
Great
job.
covers, right?
Yeah. But we're going to dive so deep, and I've had the privilege of getting to know you personally, and we've had some off-air conversations, which mean the world to me, and I'm so excited to give our listeners a little insight into your extraordinary work. Yeah,
It is different in conversation like this. So
it
I'm,
is. Yeah.
and now that we know each other a little bit, it is a great benefit to be able to talk about the work sort of
Yes.
from multiple layers.
Exactly, exactly. And, I was thinking about, because our listeners know I always start my podcast with these grounding conversations about our earliest grief beliefs. And I know from my own experience, when people have turned the tables on me, I sometimes tell different stories depending on what pops up for me. So
True.
I thought it would be useful, if you are open to it, to think back to a early experience of loss, and um, how the adults in your life were modeling grief, maybe even thinking specifically about the implicit messages that you received, and what that, yeah, taught you about what grief should or should not look or feel like. And maybe
Yes.
today, maybe specifically what grief should or shouldn't feel like in the
Yeah, in the
body.
body. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why, but the one that's popping up for me today, I come from a big Irish Catholic O'Connor family, and I used to sort of joke that weddings were when I got to see my cousins in the summer, and funerals were when I got to see my cousins in the winter. And so funerals were not uncommon in my childhood, but a kind of unusual set of events. A very dear cousin of mine died as a late teenager because of a congenital heart defect that was unknown. So extraordinarily unexpected. Just out of nowhere, they found her deceased one morning. And the funeral felt different because I'd been to a bunch of funerals, right, of sort of my grandparents' generation. And I could tell, even though I was quite young, that people were reacting differently, right? And my dear cousin Joanne, her sister, and my dear Aunt Helen, I just remember them being kind of enveloped in our large family. People were not afraid to talk to them or
Mm.
hold them, but I could still see the isolation they were feeling at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, m- I was quite young, and I know that my mother for years sent my Aunt Helen roses on the anniversary
Okay.
of my cousin's death for many years. So it's just really striking to me that, unlike much American culture, we were very steeped in the rituals and in the remembrances. And I know that that affected me in my willingness to talk with,
Yeah.
research
Yes.
participants and therapy clients and so forth about their experience. It just felt like this is what you have to do in order to figure this stuff out.
Yeah. I love that so much. And I think listeners might be feeling similarly to me, in that um, maybe we wish for a childhood like that around grief,
Yeah.
because that's such a powerful experience. And also, what you just said speaks to the fact that if we talk about it, if
Yeah.
it's normal,
Yeah.
then we don't shy away from it, for ourselves, the benefit of ourselves, but also for the benefit of others, because we're the ones who are able to turn towards. Now, some of us were raised in a family where we didn't talk about it, and then we
Yeah.
rebelled, and then we made a living talking about
Yeah.
it. But
And I think, but
yeah.
one of the last thing I'll maybe just leave this memory with is, it is that contrast that they were so enveloped in this family, and I could still feel
Yes.
the grief and the lone, the feeling of being alone,
Yeah.
that was at the same time, which is one of these mysterious things.
Both
Grief
and.
is, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Grief has
Yeah.
so many aspects to it.
Yeah.
Um, is fascinating.
Yeah. I think I'm so glad you drew that out and highlighted that there's all the grief support in the world, and the closeness and the grief literacy, and it's important.
Yes.
And it's
And
never going to erase,
no,
and it's not meant to erase
no,
in a way, or
yeah.
fix, as we always
Hmm.
say, the deep loneliness, the longing, the
Yeah.
sorrow, the anger, the all
Yes.
the things.
Yeah.
And it's a much softer container,
Yes.
I
Yes.
think, for the individual, and And your cousins, I think in particular, because this was what we call an out of order loss, I think there is another kind of loneliness where, somebody grieving a grandparent or an older parent, that there's a larger community of people to
That's right.
understand what that means. And for your cousins, they probably didn't know a single other person their age who had
No,
lost a sibling,
that's
right?
it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And even us as cousins had not, we'd
Yes.
lost a cousin. We hadn't
Yes.
lost our sister.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I always want to name for people, this isn't at the grief Olympics. This
No,
isn't a grief comparison. You had
no.
the right to grieve deeply your
Yeah,
cousin,
that's right.
and you did
And
not have the same experience as your
no,
cousins. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I thought I would start a little backwards. Does that surprise anybody listening to
Doesn't
this show
surprise
or
us.
you that I started a little backwards? But there was something that you said in the back of your book. So her latest book is The Grieving Body: How the Stress of Loss Can Be an Opportunity for Healing, which I love how you reframed and sort of invited us there. It's divided sort of into two sections, but there was something that you offered in the back of the book that reminded me of, folks know that I've trained in narrative therapy and the sort of the externalizing way we see ourselves, our body, the way we talk to ourselves, and so on, and the power that has about what we see as possible or not. And I thought I would read this passage if it's okay with you, because I think it could ground us in this idea of to learn about our bodies as the grieving body is profoundly important. And we need this offering that you shared with us. Literally, it's, sort of at the last few pages of the book, I think helps us in our conversation today to not feel overwhelmed by the idea of the grieving body, but that we can hold, well, I don't want to give away too much. I'm going to read the passage and we'll let that carry our conversation forward. It's the little section in this chapter is called To Have and to Hold. You offered, what does it mean to have a grieving body? Have you wished there was an owner's manual for your grieving body, for what to do with your physical pain? To have a grieving body means to stand outside yourself and consider that you have a grieving heart, a grieving nervous system. Given this fact, perhaps you can take a perspective that gives you ideas about how to take care of yourself, your health as you move forward. And what does it mean to be a grieving body? I loved this so much. Notice how different that sounds. To be a grieving body gives you a sense of embodiment, accepting that grieving is the reality you inhabit for now. A grieving body perceives others and events through being this way, while being wound up or exhausted. This acceptance of being a grieving body may lead to a different way forward, to an understanding and compassion toward your reaction to the world around you that can feel so foreign otherwise. And what does it mean to hold a grieving body? To hold your grieving body, to feel the tenderness you would have for a motherless child, leads to empathetic, inward directed feelings. You might comfort yourself moving forward, giving yourself more time and attention. Each of these, to have a grieving body, to be a grieving body, to hold a grieving body, are simply changes in perspective. But this changed perspective completely alters the way forward. In the midst of grief, you nonetheless have choices of perspective and movement in response. I mean, mic drop. If you're watching, you can see there are so many things I flagged in this book and highlighted, but that one I really wanted to start our conversation there. What drew you to that particular reminder or lesson to all of us?
I actually vividly remember when it came to me, I was in a yoga class, actually.
I believe that.
And I was
Yeah.
having a very tough day, and I couldn't do the things I wanted to do in yoga. And, the thing that yoga has taught me is that you have a different body every day, and that each time you do yoga, you get to learn what your body can do this time. And I slipped out to go to the bathroom and sort of take a beat. And yeah, and just that shift of perspective was so powerful for me that I'm delighted to hear that it might be like, sharing my glasses so that
Yes.
you could see that shift in perspective as
Yeah. I just to have, to be, to hold. I think this is where I am reminded over and over again how powerful words are and the way that we talk about all the various aspects of our grief can either close us in or open us up. It can add to our sense of stuckness and resistance and avoidance, or it can offer us, though not easy, a path forward, an
Yeah,
expansion. And
yeah,
that is so, I think, important, especially when we talk about the visceral experience of our body,
yeah.
because that when we tend to the pain of our body or the signals, which we're going to dive into, all the different ways our body responds to grief, it can be very quickly that we just get sort of sucked into the experience
Yes,
and can't step outside ourselves or to the above eye, the eye
that's it.
above to
Yes,
be able to look down. Yeah.
that's right. I think it's, when and I talk about shifting perspective, a few different times and ways in the book, but you can feel like if your awareness is just full of the physical difficulty and pain of grief, you can feel like you're drowning. But the idea that by simply shifting your perspective, there's another place in the book where I say, what does Mary Frances need to eat? Right.
Yes.
And it's such a different way of putting it. It's not like, oh, my stomach hurts and
Yeah.
nothing sounds good. I don't feel hungry. It's like you would with a small child. Okay, I get those things are true. And also,
Yeah.
Mary Frances needs to eat something. What are we going to give her?
Absolutely. That shifting of perspective and what you just modeled there too, it's not just a shifting of perspective that's the neutralness of it. There's a real intentional
Yeah,
compassion. And you
that's right.
speak a lot especially in the second half of the book, about your own practice, but also what you've learned from the science about mindfulness, about perspective, about deep self-compassion.
Yeah.
And I think we'll definitely get back into it. But I sort of landing that or rooting ourselves or grounding ourselves in this idea that we can to have and to hold and to be a grieving body. We know, hopefully almost everybody listening knows, and if they haven't yet, they're going to run out and understand that there is such a thing called the grieving brain, and your research and your work has really helped all of us practitioners and individuals move forward in our understanding of the impact of grief in the brain. And of course, the brain is not separate from the body, even though
Right.
we like to pretend that
Yes.
they are two different things.
Mhm.
And so I know even when we talked last time that you were already thinking about how do we help us all better understand the pathways between the two and how, and maybe we start with stress
Mhm.
as
Yeah.
a founding sort of core issue. I mean, even, made it to your subtitle, but the
Yeah.
core issue that is showing up in, again, both places, even though we're all just one big organism. But what do we
Right.
need to know about stress and the
Yeah.
grieving body? Where would, yeah,
I think that grief loss specifically is one thing that causes us stress, but we sometimes forget it's one of the greatest stressors that human beings and social mammals deal with is the loss of someone to whom they are bonded.
yes,
And what I think about that is two things. When I'm explaining stress the way that psychologists have come to understand it, I think of that old-timey balance scale, the
yes,
pans, you put gold on one side and then you put weights on the other side. And the reason that that visual comes to mind is because we think about the idea that there are demands that the world puts on us,
right.
and then there's resources we have to meet those demands. And when those two things are out of balance, when the old-timey scale
Yeah.
is not even, right? Then that is when we are experiencing stress. And so what that means is loss brings lots of demands into our world and often robs us of some resources.
Yes.
And so what's important about that, I think, is that the brain in some ways is keeping track of what Lisa Feldman Barrett calls our body budget, right?
Yes. I love
So
that term
I
so
love
much.
that
Yeah.
term. So the idea that, the food we eat, the time we spend sleeping,
Social
the hugs we
connections.
get. Yep, exactly. All of these are resources that our body has to respond to these demands of, waves of grief and lots of crying, and
Yes.
also
The
trying to.
paperwork and the
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. So many demands. And so the brain is really trying to balance that scale for us. And it's not so possible initially. And that we can learn to try to reduce our experience of the demands or to increase our resources. And then when we can't, to be compassionate that we are a
Yes.
little off kilter.
Yeah. Yeah. There is no perfect way to do this. You
No.
will be off kilter. So to
Yes.
normalize that, but to your point, which we will come up time and time again, I imagine in our conversation, to bring a compassionate, mindful
Yeah,
noticing that
that's
that's
right.
what's happening
Mhm. And it
to
just
that.
gives you, I feel like it gives us more inroads. So, I mean, this is why I used this term opportunity
Yes.
in the subtitle, not because it's an opportunity anyone would want.
No.
No one would want
We are
loss.
not everything happens for a reasoning our way through
No.
this. Absolutely
Mm-mm.
not. Yeah.
No toxic positivity here. But given that we are experiencing loss, and given that we're going to have day after day of this upcoming, it is a way that, you know, it's like the volume dial gets turned up on everything, right? The
Yes.
emotions are more intense, the thoughts are faster, the bodily sensations are more unexpected. And because of that, we can learn to listen to those things
Yes.
and then try a few things and see what does actually bring our heart rate down. Not what we think will bring our heart rate down,
Yeah.
but what actually makes you feel soothed, what actually improves your blood pressure or your digestion. And then you know that about yourself. That's incredible. The
Yes.
incredible power of authentically knowing, no, this is what I need right now, and this
Yeah.
is how I can respond, because the grief isn't necessarily going away, and
No.
so you're going to have to learn how to respond.
Yeah, those you
Yeah.
have to build that toolkit,
Yeah.
and I often find myself saying to the clients I work with and to myself, because by the way, if you've ever
Mhm.
been a client, I'm saying the things to you I say to myself, is that every small act of agency
Yeah.
we take,
Yeah.
even if it's, "Hey, Lisa, what does your body need to eat?" And then
Yeah.
meeting that need
Mhm.
is healing, because so much of the suffering that we experience in grief is that something happened to us
That's right.
that was out of our control, that activates our nervous system, that stress response. And so just little, even though it might seem like a little dosable moment, if you're listening today and you just did one thing, even pressing play on this podcast,
That's right.
to really notice, almost like take a Polaroid. Okay, that's
Mhm.
one action I took.
Yes.
It's not meant to erase the grief, but it's an
No.
action I took, and it can remind me
Mhm.
that I have this capacity.
That's right. And
Yeah.
to notice whether it made a
And then
difference.
evaluate. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because then you learn how to go forward. I have a very close friend who goes to yoga every so often, and it makes her really angry. It drives her bananas, right? So she just gets so frustrated by the pace,
Yes.
and that's authentically her.
Yeah.
And
It's like
that's
good
okay.
information.
Exactly. It doesn't work for her. Don't do yoga if it makes you mad.
Exactly. Exactly. Maybe give it a few times, but if you've done
Two
a few
times.
and then you're
And
still
then
mad,
you realize this is not for me.
not for you. I always say, just how I talk about emotions, I think we've had this conversation before. I don't trade in that there are positive and negative emotions. I really
No.
don't like that language, but emotions are information. And so
Yes.
is that reaction of
Yeah.
like, huh, this is what's coming up for me. I can use it as information.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So you touched on just a little bit ago, I thought I would help us start to think about the research that you've been doing as we think about the grieving body. And you touched on sort of this notion of the broken heart. And so many of us, sort of in the ether, in the culture, have heard of this sort of broken heart syndrome. What did the research show you? What did you learn about um, the
Yeah.
literal broken heart that can
Yeah.
happen in the wake of loss. When we come back, Mary Frances begins to unpack what she and other researchers have learned about the physiological impact of profound loss on our heart and all other systems in our bodies. As she's already alluded to so far in our conversation, learning and understanding about our grieving bodies is not meant to make us feel defeated or to see things as inevitable. Instead, it's an opportunity to cultivate a new relationship with our bodies, a chance to tend to ourselves in a new way. You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. So, I've been dreaming up how to show up for you and with you in new ways. Don't worry, this show isn't going anywhere. And yet, more than ever, I'm passionate about creating meaningful community and offering you more insight into my work and more about my life, too, to be honest. I want a place to explore more topics in depth, and I'm hoping to expand my creative expression to include long form essays, audio and video guided practices, a place to host some behind the scenes of the podcast, and maybe even eventually a Dear Lisa column. But most importantly, I want to build an authentic, interactive community off social media. Life is happening so fast, and I want a place where we can slow down, dive in deeper, and figure out how to metabolize it all together. And I'd love to have you join me. That's why I recently launched my Substack called AFGO with Lisa Keefauver. AFGO, if you haven't heard me talk about it in my book, from the stage, or even here on my podcast, stands for Another Fucking Growth Opportunity. Yes, of course, I had to get in a judicious use of cussing. But rest assured, my friends, like I do in all my work, I'm going to show up authentically and offer thoughtful, meaningful, sometimes humorous, but always practical guidance on how to center aliveness in a world full of loss. I look forward to your comments, our chats, creating special audio and video content for you, and so much more. And don't worry, if you like things delivered to your inbox without having to search the web for it, AFGO with Lisa Keefauver will be delivered directly to you. You can head to Substack after the show and sign up at afgowithlisakeefauver.substack.com, or just head to my website at lisakeefauver.com and you can sign up from there.
We think of the broken heart as a metaphor, but it turns out it's actually a regular old hardcore black and white data point.
Yes.
And it's one of the oldest data points that has inspired me as a grief researcher, but actually has inspired a number of my colleagues quite independently. So it is the finding that people are more likely to experience illness and death after the death of a loved one. So literally the statistic is, for example, men whose wives have died in the first 3 months after that loss are almost twice as likely to die of a heart attack as another man who's very similar,
Yeah.
whose wife does not die. And it's very high for women as well. It's slightly attenuated, but the point is, we've actually known about this since the 1960s. We've been repeating this
Okay.
epidemiological finding again and again, and which is comforting as a
Right.
scientist. You
Yes.
think, oh, okay, no, this is a real thing. This didn't just happen at one
It
time
wasn't
in
a fluke.
history or,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, in some subculture. This is how the body has reacted. And so for myself, then, the question has been, well, let's take that further. If we know that, what are we going to do about it?
Yes.
And and why? Why does that happen? How does that work? How does the death of someone we're bonded with get into our heart muscle tissue? How does that work? And so those are the questions that I've been studying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think for those of us who are non-scientists and maybe want
Sure.
kind of, I hate to do a bullet point, but what do you think are the themes that you discovered in there? And maybe I'll plant the seed to, there's something you talked about reducing our risk
Yeah.
there, but maybe
Yeah.
start with
Yep.
what do we need to know is happening in our bodies that is leading to this?
I think that in the long term, we will learn that there is an acute risk that is quite specific in grief, and is very cardiovascular often. Other things as well, so increased stroke and so forth. But that initial risk, I think we have to be very aware of that as soon as someone dies in our emergency department or ICU or, uh,
Hospice or
hospice, nursing home, wherever they are, that the person standing next to them,
yeah.
their risk has suddenly gone up. We can identify who that is. And it's my longtime goal to really help our medical system, our healthcare system to understand this is a risk now that we can actually do something about.
Right.
So some of this is making people aware that it is a risk, that they should take heart symptoms very seriously in these contexts. Um, but also that for most of us, our body is resilient. Our body is able to absorb that blow, even when it feels
Like
it
it's not.
physically, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That our body's role is to react and recover, right? So we
Yes.
can facilitate that recovery, but not to be afraid of our body, not to be afraid of our physical response, but to be aware of it, so that we can judge, have we gone outside the sort of normal bounds of what my heart can
Yeah.
manage? I really should be seeking care here. So there's this acute piece, but the second sort of scientific fact that has really motivated me, I started thinking about a lot when I started my postdoctoral work at UCLA. And it isn't just the heart, it turns out,
Oh, that's
right?
so phenomenally
And
amazing.
yeah, so what the finding shows is that what they call all cause mortality and morbidity or illness goes up. And so that means people are more likely to get sepsis and diabetes and COPD and colon cancer. And you think, well, that's not how the body works,
And
right? Why?
autoimmune
Right.
diseases,
What,
right?
how
Yeah.
is this? How does that? And so in my postdoctoral work, I started thinking about the immune system
Yeah.
and our hormone systems and realized that they touch every organ of the body, right? So in my own work during that time, I did find that inflammation levels on average are higher in people who are bereaved. And so it means if you have rheumatoid arthritis, your joints hurt more.
Right.
But if
Yeah.
you have asthma, it's harder to breathe, right?
Yes.
Your joints hurting and having difficulty breathing sound like completely unrelated things. But actually, if it's inflammation at the base of each of them, then you start to see, oh, in the stress response I'm having, it's changing my inflammation. And that's leading to some of these symptoms I'm seeing.
Right. And inflammation, we are now understanding, right, is kind of the root
Yeah,
cause of
a
disease
lot of
and a lot
issues.
of disease in general.
Yeah.
So we're thinking about the sort of, I don't want to call it trickle down effect, but sort of the effect of this acute loss triggering what we all kind of think of as the chronic stress state or the fight
Yes.
or flight, freeze, fawn, whatever state,
Mm,
flooding our body with cortisol and all the
yeah.
things, which
Yeah.
then naturally our body shuts down all the other things that are they don't need to be in fight. And so this is where I think your language in the book is really so helpful. It's like, thank you, body, for protecting me. You're
Yes.
doing your job. So instead
Yes.
of, judging ourselves for
That's right.
having this critical chronic stressor reaction, I felt very much, and this is where I said this to you off air, but I want to say on air. I mean, getting to know you personally, I love how accessible you make your scientific work and have for this whole time. And I really saw more of you, and we might talk about how that felt to be a
Sure.
scientist, bringing more of your full self to the work, not that you didn't before. But part of what I really felt in this book, even more, though I saw it play out in The Grieving Brain, is how you modeled us having deep compassion for the experience of the grieving body, including, and you didn't, these are my words, not yours. I'm not, but hey, body, thank you so much for going into action to defend me against this incomprehensible, or as our friend Dr. Joe Cacciatore says, the unbearable loss.
Yes.
Um, and how can I soften and remind you that I can be present. I don't need to be in that state.
Yeah.
So how do you think about
Yeah.
educating? You were talking about educating
Mhm.
doctors, like, hey, this person is at risk, or educate. It's
Yeah.
like, how do we let people know, hey, you're at risk,
Yeah.
without judging or
Mhm.
shaming,
Yeah.
while also giving them the tools, like, you're going to still be grieving, but can we bring it down to,
Yeah.
the zone of
Yeah.
tolerance? How do you manage,
Yes.
or how do you think about those things? Yeah.
Yeah, I think of two sort of ways in general. And one is that, in the grieving brain, I sort of introduced this idea that grieving is a form of learning.
Yes.
And, it's learning, what does it mean that my person is gone? How am I going to be retired if all my plans
Yes.
included this person? Or how am I going to get through college, right?
Yeah.
If my mom died and
Yeah.
she's always been my cheerleader. So, but it turns out it's learning for your body as well. So
Mm.
we forget that when we are bonded with someone, that it isn't just an emotional experience, that our bodies are co-regulating as well. I
Yes.
like to
I'm
say,
so glad you're gonna talk about co-regulation. That's so
yeah,
important. Okay.
that I am an external pacemaker for my partner and he is for me. And so some of it is that your body has to figure out, how am I going to arrive home from work after a stressful day if I'm not getting the hug that usually brings my blood pressure down, right?
Yes.
Like, that is going to take time for your body to figure out, how do I rebalance the budget now that this is true? So some of it is going to happen naturally. Our bodies and our brains are very smart, it turns out. Our bodies are going through this learning curve. They are healing in the same way that a tree will,
Yeah.
heal, or or your hair will grow, right? It's a process. It's going to take time.
Yeah.
Um, and while that is happening, we want to make sure that people are safe,
Yeah.
and that their body hasn't gone so far out of whack.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I say it, that's the
Yeah.
medical term, out of whack, right?
Sounds very
No, but
Latin based.
it
Yeah.
very Latin,
Yeah.
yes. But I think of this as a strange analogy. Bereavement is a little like pregnancy. And the
Okay.
reason I say that, pregnancy is not a disease. Pregnancy is not a disorder. But no one would say it's not physiological, right? It is a very physical process. It's also a very emotional process, and so
Emotional
forth,
also
right?
impacts your brain.
Impacts
Yep.
your relationships, your community, the whole
Yeah.
9 yards.
Yeah.
But we recognize it's also a medically risky time.
Yes.
And so even though it's not a disease, we have set up prenatal care so that we can check in and say, hey, so do I have gestational diabetes, right?
Yeah.
Do I have hypertension? And then we treat those just like hypertension, just like diabetes, because the body, as it does, this difficult physical thing, has gotten outside the bounds.
Yes.
So in my mind, I think bereavement is a time when we have to just go for our regular medical checkup. And often if a person we've been caring for has been terminally ill, it's probably been a long time since we had our teeth cleaned or went for our mammogram or whatever.
Exactly.
And it's hard to motivate at this time when you don't feel like putting matching shoes on, much
Yeah.
less making an appointment for a colonoscopy.
Right.
But these are just the normal medical tests that will pick up, has my body gotten so far out of the norm that it's going into a problem area that I won't, come back from in the same way. So getting, even as we're supporting people who are grieving, checking in with them. Have you had your blood pressure tested?
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
I love that so much. So many themes. My brain is spinning in about 4 different directions. So many
Right.
themes I wanna go, but I love that analogy so much. If you're watching online, you just saw that I literally my brain exploded. Maybe you could see the, stars 'cause going out shooting out from my head. I love that analogy so much. It's instead of pathologizing the embodied experience and reaction to grief like we wouldn't do to a pregnant woman.
No.
This is how we show up for a griever. I think that's such a beautiful analogy, both if you're listening for your own experience of grief, if you're going through grieving and loss and you're noticing these things, but also as somebody who wants to be a grief supporter to what you alluded to, which is one of the ways you can be a helpful grief supporter is not start sentences with at least, and do show up and say, "Do you need help? You know, when's the last time you saw your GP? Would you like help
Yeah.
making an appointment or I could drive you there," etcetera.
Yeah.
I literally 2 days after my husband died in my arms, I ended up at an emergency dentist because, of course, my dentist was out of town,
Of course.
and had to check the box widow box for the first
Oh,
time, had to have an emergency root canal.
yes. Right?
And my body had been holding on because his misdiagnosis led to a
Yes.
lot of stressors in our life. I was not ta I was just trying to keep him and my daughter and myself alive,
Yes.
and my body was like, "And done."
Yeah. And now we
My
can't
tooth
wait
was
any
like,
longer.
by,
Exactly.
infection,
Exactly.
like, it led to infection and
Exactly.
inflammation. So, I know
That's
this
accurate.
for sure.
Yeah.
Having just survived cancer, I have some thoughts of my own about some of the stressors and the
Yes.
grief that has been embodied that may have not that I'm blaming myself for my cancer, but
No.
I'm much more attuned to that and also
Mhm.
attuned to what we talked about in the very beginning to have and to hold and to be a grieving body, the power of that perspective
Yeah.
taking,
Yeah.
even and especially when you're in
Yeah.
the depths of some kind of physical pain, though feels impossible,
Yes.
actually allowed me so many times to come back into my body, to listen to what I needed,
Yes.
to tend to reducing my physical, emotional suffering, even just by, a few
Yeah.
percentage points. That was
Mhm.
huge. Yeah.
It is. It is. And I think, the thing I think I feared about writing this book, because people are going to have physical symptoms
Yeah.
after a death. They're
Yeah.
going to have an upset stomach or a
Yes.
lump in their throat
And
or
not
whatever it
sleeping or
is.
sleeping too much or yeah,
Absolutely. And
yeah.
and I didn't want people to be afraid of that, and I also wanted them to make sure
Be aware.
it was typical, right? And
Yeah.
so it's okay to go to your doctor and say, "Hey, I have diarrhea every time I eat. Is that normal?" And have
Yeah.
them say, "Well, let's run some tests." And then if what they tell you is, everything looks okay. I think you're moving food through your body pretty fast right now because you're, dealing with all this stress of grief. Can we find some ways to try and add to your
Yeah.
resources, learn some things about managing your stress, and we'll have time and experience help you along the learning curve. And then come back in 4 months, 6 months,
Yeah.
and we'll see how things are going. It doesn't have to mean that we're getting something checked out and that we must get a diagnosis, but
Right.
rather we're just getting it checked out to make sure. And then we go back to, oh, this is how my body reacts during grieving. How can I support it?
Yeah, I love that, and it's really more of a monitoring approach.
Yeah.
It's starting with that awareness and then
Yeah.
monitoring, and yeah,
Mhm.
to your point, like, do not walk away from listening to this episode or reading the book when you do, which, by the way, please do because extraordinary. Is not yes, we're not, trying to make people become paranoid about their health. It's
No.
a more of an affirmation of, like,
Mhm.
yes, you need people to bring you casseroles, although
Mhm.
maybe cool on the casseroles, right? Or whatever. Like,
Whatever works.
we need the hugs, we need the social connection, which I wanna talk about also in relationship. I think some of the themes I wanna touch on that I think might be a surprise to people are attachment and social connections. Yes, we need those casseroles and the other things, and we can recognize and bring with such care to a way that our whole body is moving through this grief. This isn't, which is much to the theme of both of our works. Grief is not
Yes.
all in your head,
No.
though it's there too.
Yeah.
Um, and it's just another way of offering care.
That's it.
It's just
Exactly.
another way of offering care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And each of us have different, so I myself received the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis.
Yes.
A little more than a year after my mom had died. And what's so clear to me is her loss didn't cause my multiple sclerosis, right? It
Yes.
runs in my family. I have a ton of risk factors. But is it any surprise that in the moment when my body was so stressed that that's when the symptoms really emerged and
Yes.
became clear? No, that's maybe not a surprise. And also, she didn't cause, her death
Yes.
didn't
Right.
cause my MS, both can be true.
And that's what I was sort of saying about my cancer.
Right.
It's not, I don't think necessarily cause, but I do think
Yeah.
when you're in undergoing, and I had been for the previous year and a half
Yes.
before the cancer diagnosis, extreme stress, it's our body knocking at the door, right?
Yes.
Like, hey, something's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked a little bit in this book, more than I've seen in other places, speaking of that, around the fact that you came to grips with this diagnosis of MS just as you were grieving the death of your mom, who died from breast cancer, I
That's
believe.
right. Yes.
When you look back at day one, month one version of
Mm.
you
Yeah.
receiving that diagnosis, is there something you wish you could have said to her, would have said to her, now that you know what you know, both from your own lived experience, but also
Yeah.
from the research?
Yeah. Oh, that's such an interesting question. I've thought of what I would say maybe to me right after my mom died, but
Yes.
I
Well, you can
haven't
share that too.
necessarily, sure. Yeah. But it
Yeah.
is interesting to think, what would I say to myself who was newly diagnosed? And I say, and there's something somewhat similar in each because, as I say in the book, the neurologist told me when I was diagnosed, the first 5 years will tell you a lot about what the MS is going to look like for you. And I thought, 5 years?
Years.
But what's interesting is you could say the same to a grieving person, right?
I
The
know.
next 5 years will tell you a lot about what your
Yeah.
life will look like without this person.
Right.
And that sounds crazy, and it is true.
You're listening to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Now, since you're listening to the show, you already recognize that we experience all sorts of losses in our lives. Whether it's a death loss or a loss of health, ability, dream, or other, each requires us to tend to the sorrow and grief that comes with it. When we come back, Mary Frances explains the parallel she sees in learning to navigate the world in the wake of the losses that come with an MS diagnosis to the grieving we experience in the wake of a death loss and others. Your body knows. That's a chapter in my book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. And I wanted to read this passage to you today about how we all hold a sort of internal calendar for our grief. Sometimes you don't need the calendar to tell you what day or season it is. You feel it in your body, your heart, and your soul. You know with all your being that this is the anniversary of the time that changed everything. Maybe you know the feeling I'm talking about, when your body knows before your mind does. Maybe you wake up earlier than normal or can't sleep. Perhaps you're flooded with overwhelming and terrifying fear. Instead of ignoring these things, maybe get curious about why your body feels so heavy. Observe the tightness in your chest, or maybe notice the aching in your body, the extreme fatigue, or the screaming in your head. These kinds of internal calendar alerts happen to various degrees across our grief journey. I promise. They're not setbacks or signs that you're not healing. And I know how scary and overwhelming they can feel. For a few years, I didn't understand what was happening to my body and mind every July and August. That's my season of the calendar that's full of landmines. Headaches, aches, pains, colds, fatigue, clumsiness, you name it. I would ignore my body and search my dreams and memories for what could be bringing on this extreme shift and dismiss the constellation of aches and pains and issues in my body because the feelings weren't happening on the exact day. There can be obvious days and not so obvious days. For me, it's the day I got the call that Eric's MRI results are back and they found out it was a brain tumor. It's the few days after that when we celebrated what turned out to be our last wedding anniversary. The day of his first brain surgery, the next day when I heard his voice for the last time. It was also the day of his second brain surgery and the day he died in my arms. This all takes place over the course of 2.5 weeks, but my body typically alerts me that the season is coming prior to the series of anniversaries. You too have your own internal calendar of grief. And I want to encourage you to tune in to yourself, just as Mary Frances and I are suggesting in this episode. If you found that useful, I also would love to encourage you to pick up a copy of my book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss, wherever you shop for your favorite books.
So I think the idea that, I think the parallels here is a loss of a loved one is something that just changes the trajectory of your life. It changes what you know. And having a chronic illness is something that just changes the trajectory of your life. And we are all on a learning curve of what it means to have lost a partner or a parent. We are all on a learning curve of what it means to age and have less function than we did last year or 10 years ago. So, in some weird way, I think I would say to myself, this is just life with more knowledge and a wider understanding of the ups and the downs.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe not to be in as much of a rush to figure it out as you were when, I was
Yes. Yeah.
26, 27,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I so appreciate those parallels and the reminder um, of the striving that we have to get ahead of the learning curve, which, as I probably say almost in some form or fashion on every episode of this show, is normal because we
It
humans are
is.
storytelling creatures and we
We
do not
wanna
like
do it.
ambiguity
We
and
do
we do not
not.
like uncertainty for a lot of great survival reasons.
Yes.
And even outside of receiving a diagnosis, even outside of the profound loss of a loved one, things change.
Exactly.
So we're always in that learning curve, and
Always.
the more we can practice, which maybe we'll touch on some of the tools you talked about, the more we can practice being with the ambiguity and the uncertainty, with bringing compassion to the learning and the not knowing, then the smoother or more cared for the ride is. I'm not going to say, I don't want to use the word easier, but certainly smoother. But
Yeah.
before we get there, I thought
Yeah.
maybe, one of the other themes in here, and I don't know if it's just from me nerding out as a social worker who was interested in this stuff, or, I've recently had our dear friend Allison Gilbert on the show to talk about social
Yeah.
connection and isolation. What do we need to understand about maybe first attachment and the grieving body?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you learn? Yeah.
Fascinating that even other social mammals who bond for life, we see the physiological reaction in them when their mate disappears, for example. And and it really strikes me. So John Bowlby, who did a lot of work both with infants and then with his scientist colleagues who were looking at animals, really understanding that the behaviors that we show when we have loss, the feelings of protesting this can't possibly be true and despairing that it is true, that those come with physiological changes, like changes in oxytocin levels and
Yes.
changes in cortisol, and in ways that we are still very much at the beginning of unraveling.
Okay.
But importantly, those social connections, those attachment connections, are affecting our body. And what it means, ironically, is that also the support and love that we feel for ourselves and from others are affecting our physiology as well.
Right. That's like the bad news, good news. It's like the person
Exactly.
being gone is causing us that protest and despair, which that section of your book I thought was so fascinating. I mean, the
Mm.
whole thing, but and the highlighting the importance of not that we're replacing our person that we lost,
No.
but that the connections that we can have, our
Yes.
friends, our family, our support groups, our therapists,
Yes.
whoever, our pets,
Yes.
um, can balance out or reduce some of the harm that's happening when that attachment is severed.
That's right.
Does that,
That's
yeah.
exactly it. So what's interesting is, you probably have 1 or 2 or 3 people who are in your life who are sort of your one and only.
Yeah.
These we
Yeah.
think of as our
Yes.
attachment figures, right?
Yeah.
The people you can always turn to or, and and that we also have really important connections beyond those as well. And that all of those are important in our life. Like you said, it's not that one replaces another. A long-term relationship, even if that long term is, 7 months of pregnancy,
Right.
a long-term bonded relationship has different physiological correlates
Okay.
than a good friend, a
Or more
colleague, an
acquaintance.
acquaintance. But getting a smile from an acquaintance still impacts our physiology,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, no, it's not the same. And also, we need other human beings and we need to be able to tap in to feeling cared for by ourselves, from others, in nature, right? When
Yes.
we're in the awe-inspiring, mountain or ocean, that it is the capacity to tap into that that means we work with those hormone systems instead of against.
Yeah. I love the way you explained and also with examples, your own life. I think Lizzie,
Mm.
our mutual friend Lizzie, you had a
Yes.
lot of great examples in the book of how that protest and despair and then how we move to practices of social connection to again, it's not about
No.
replacing, it's about alleviating
Yeah.
when we sort of get out of that zone
Yes.
and come back into that zone of neutrality so that our body is at least, in some kind of homeostasis or on its way
Yeah.
to healing. I think um, yeah, it's just such an important reminder.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that practice is such a funny word. It feels like a
I know.
weird thing to think about. But
Except life is practice, by the way,
well, isn't
guys.
it? I mean, it really
Yeah.
is. But the idea that we can set up, if you break a bone and you put a cast on it, that cast is not actually helping knit those cells back together. Knitting those cells back together is a natural process that will happen. But that support of that cast is enabling that to happen in a safe way, right?
Just dropping the analogy bombs today, Mary Frances. I love it.
And so I think of the practices that we can do that function as that cast. So they're not going to solve anything, but they might give us an environment in which we are safer to
Yeah.
heal. So, for example, most people who are grieving have some form of insomnia. They can't fall asleep or they can't stay asleep. Um, and one of the things that we can do, that we can practice, is actually by getting up at the same time each day. It helps the body to know, oh, this is the schedule I'm supposed to be on. You
Right.
can't force yourself to go to sleep.
Yeah.
But if you get up at the same time and you get some light in your day and you get some movement in your day, then it's a practice that helps to reset the body so that that's a resource then as you're dealing with the grief.
I love
It's,
that.
so
Yeah.
the things that we can set up as practices or habits that just sort of remind us, okay, I just have to get through this next 24 hours and
Yes.
then I will do this again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's around those. I like I mean, I use the language of practices all the time or containers, right?
Yeah.
Um, I so appreciate that analogy. I wanted to name, I mean, we're not touching, and we don't have time today, maybe for our
Sure.
next part two conversation, to talk about how all of these things are nice, but we also live in a culture and systems that
Yes.
don't have doctors necessarily who
True.
will attend to that. So I can't not acknowledge that. That's that social worker part of my hat on.
Absolutely.
But one of the things that I wanted to invite you to share about, either from your own personal lived experience, and I know there were some samples in the book, is um, I think one of the chapters of my book was like why going places and seeing people is exhausting and grief.
Yes.
And I really talk about that both and of like, here's why it is exhausting and here's why you still need to do it.
Yes.
Even though sometimes people suck,
Yes.
because as my other chapter title goes, people say stupid shit.
Mhm.
Um, sometimes. So what do we need to know about how we discern what are the social connections that work for us? Where do we sort of push against maybe that sort of protest behavior that comes naturally to us and lean in so that we don't get to that place where we are stuck in despair
Yeah.
in terms
Yeah.
of kind of social connection? What have you learned about that? Yeah.
It's so important. I think for me, a big learning curve was understanding the difference between energy and motivation.
Mm.
So, energy for me, in a very physical sense, is I genuinely only have so much gas in the tank. And that, in terms of my body budget, I can spend the gas on lots of things, but once the gas is gone, I can't spend any more. And so that, it turns out, is actually different than whether I want to do something or not, right? So
Yes.
let's, have the example of a colleague is having a birthday party. And the question to me is it that I don't have the energy to go, as in I'm not going to be able to then get a good night's sleep and I'm not able to, think through my lecture the next day? Or is it I am completely unmotivated to leave my house, put real shoes on, and talk to people, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that the difference is important is if it is genuinely about energy, then you have to learn what are the right ways to spend my budget so that I don't have no social time. You
Yes.
can't only spend the budget on work or else you will become very depressed. You need to use some of your gas for being with people. But that's a different question than why am I not motivated to go, right?
I love this notion of differentiating between, do I have kind of like the energy and do I have the motivation, and kind of being a discerner of those two things.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the two. Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's important is our motivation is very often about our values, right? So if you think, I really need to be seeing people more, then finding the motivation to do that is different from, I'm challenged by not having enough energy to do this, and I need to be targeting what are the ways to improve my resources so that I can use my energy differently. I think that it can be subtle, but often my answer is try doing it anyway
Yes.
and to overcome the motivation issue, and then have a plan B in case you don't have the energy. And just be honest up front about, I may not be able to stay very long or something like that.
Absolutely. I've had that conversation with clients, and I've done a whole piece, and there's an episode here on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch about using that as one of the strategies to navigate the holidays in grief.
Yes.
In
Perfect
particular,
time.
a perfect time, but we need it in early grief. Sometimes we need
Yeah,
it farther down the road. We need it at times when
absolutely.
we're re-grieving.
Yes.
And I think, to your point, is sometimes we have to fake the motivation
Yes.
to try it, all with
Mhm.
the I always find, do you have your exit buddy? That's what I tell people. Like,
Yes.
do you have your
That's
exit
right.
buddy to get out, or your plan ahead?
For
And
sure.
then I think another piece, I'm curious if you think about this, is then evaluate afterwards.
Yes,
Maybe not
exactly.
that night or that day, but
No, probably
somewhere,
not.
probably not, but maybe the next day.
Yeah.
Like, did it overall, did it
Mhm.
add to my balance of my
Yeah.
energy account, or did it draw? And then just use that as information. So maybe it's
Exactly.
okay, but I can't do 5 of those in 1 week. I can
Exactly.
only do 1.
Exactly. Well, and I think there's a way it helps with your expectations as well. So if you're saying to yourself, Mary Frances needs to get out of the house, then maybe you don't go to the party and think, I'm going to have a rip roaring good time. But
Yeah.
you can come home and say, I did get out of the house.
Yeah.
I may not have thoroughly enjoyed it,
Yeah.
but I did the thing that I felt that I needed, which was to get out of the house. So that helps with expectations as well.
Absolutely. And it goes back to what we were touching on earlier in the conversation, which was reminding ourselves that we have agency.
Yes, exactly.
And I think I just cannot, in my estimation, I cannot overestimate the importance of that
Yes,
reminder, because so much of the despair and sometimes the overwhelm and sometimes what we call stuckness, in our grief is because we've gone so long without connecting or feeling connected to our agency.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I want to close the conversation, which I can't believe we're already to the
I
end of the
know.
hour, but
Here we are.
here we are, and I'll find a way to get you back here
Good.
another day. We'll have another conversation. Is thinking about, given that we know our body is going to have, and unique to each of us, a
Mhm,
series of physiological reactions, most acute probably in the first few months,
mhm,
and maybe not even quite right away, because maybe shock is actually kind of protecting us. And that we want to be checking in mindfully for ourselves and others, maybe our regular physician visits,
mhm.
etc. That social connection is important to helping to alleviate some of the physiological impact. How do you think about movement in general,
Mm,
both as a tool of discharging stress? I think
mm,
about kind of the work of, like, I always come back to the Nagoski sisters, in their
mhm,
book, right? Or just thinking about the discharging, like, stress isn't bad, but stress is not meant to hang around. So how have
mhm,
you used, I heard you say yoga, or
mhm.
how do you just think in general from the research, from your own personal life, what do we know about movement as a way to attend to our grieving body?
Such a good question. And I don't think I'm always going through the
Yeah.
like Rolodex in my
Research
head of grief
Rolodex.
research. Yes. And I can't think of something that is exactly specific to what you're describing. But what I will say is a body needs movement to be healthy, and movement can contribute to the building the resources, right? So something I had to discover was I wasn't going to be able to exercise with the MS diagnosis in the way that I had anticipated. And
Yes.
so I had to learn new ways that worked for me. Many in the MS community will know of something called chair yoga,
Yeah.
right? And not just the MS community, but it is popular there.
Yes.
And so thinking about if movement is important, then what does that look like for me right now? Um, my friend who really dislikes yoga gets on the elliptical 3 days a week,
Yes.
and so thinking about building that resource because you're in a moment where there are so many demands. So trying to think of it that way might be helpful for people.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And there was a word, a tiny little word, 3 letters that you put there, or maybe 2, 3-letter words, which was "for now."
Yes.
And I think part of, again, coming back to, if you're starting to notice maybe the physiological impact
Yeah.
on your body, or you're noticing the grief brain or the grief fog, the awareness is an important part. And to your concern about putting the data out there, we can get tricked if we're not careful into thinking, well, this is how it's always going to be,
Absolutely.
and that I don't have control. And so that "for now"
Yes.
is like, which is so important.
It's
Yeah.
so important. And thinking, I'm going to set up a system for myself that I'm not going to pull the trigger on for another 2 months. That
Yes.
works too,
Yeah.
right? Um
Or
I-
this week. I mean, our time segments in early grief, by the
exactly.
way,
Are
sometimes are
so
minutes,
yeah.
hours.
Absolutely.
They're not necessarily
And
days or weeks. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. And so it might be, I'm gonna walk around the block, that is I think of it as what can I do for now? And how does that make me think about a trajectory? That walking around the block today makes a tremendous difference as to whether you can walk around the block tomorrow,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And whether next week you can walk around it twice.
Yes.
So again, and funny, you were talking about the shift in perspective at the beginning of the episode. I think this is one of these shifts of perspective. Where am I right now? And how is what I'm doing right now going to help me now? And how is it a part of a sequence of events that I hope will be facilitating my future?
Yeah. Facilitating the healing of your grieving body. It's the opportunity that you've been talking about this whole episode. My friend, what an absolute treasure and delight to be in conversation with you. Listeners, I'm going to drop the link in the show notes. Get yourself a copy of The Grieving Body or gift it to a friend that you know who's grieving as a way to say, I see you, I understand, and I'll be there to check in on you and your grieving body too. Thanks so much for joining me today, my friend.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for bringing this to people.
Oh my gosh, such a pleasure. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Didn't I tell you, my friends, Mary Frances O'Connor is an absolute delight. The way she brings her various parts, scientist, researcher, and fellow griever, to this episode, and all the work she does is truly a gift. It actually reminds me of the way Ashley Consolo, researcher, educator, and environmental advocate, brought her whole self to our conversation on environmental grief a few seasons ago. If you missed that episode, Exploring Ecological Grief, I highly encourage you to give it a listen too. But back to today's special guest. To learn more about my friend Mary Frances O'Connor and the incredible work she is continuing to do, visit maryfrancesoconnor.org. I also highly encourage you to pick up copies of both of her books, The Grieving Brain and her latest book, The Grieving Body. If you do it online, may I suggest you shop for it at bookshop.org so that you're supporting independent bookstores? And if, like me, you love to browse a bookstore, you can always head to your favorite neighborhood shop to pick up your copies there. Now, I just want to ask, did you love today's conversation? Did you learn something new? If so, I'd love your help ensuring this show gets out to other grievers who might need it too. Of course, you can share the episodes via text, email, or do it on social media. And if you do, please tag me at Lisa Keefauver, MSW. But you can also do that by leaving a 5-star rating and writing a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to or watching this episode. It would mean the world to me. I want to give a special thanks to Giles Smith, as always, of Alafia Sounds for the music. Okay, my grieving friends, remember that, yes, grief is a sneaky bitch, but don't worry, I've got your back. Until next time, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart.